everyone, my name is Kailee Ding, and then I'm going to be talking about gender-based violence in South Africa, specifically the case of Unene Matwana. All right, so jumping in, I'm just going to give a little outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to start by talking about what gender-based violence in South Africa is, where it stems from. I'm going to be talking about the case of Uwewe, the facts of the case, as well as the #AmINext movement, going into the public reaction and protests that followed, and then the activists who were a big part of it. All right, so the introduction to gender-based violence in South Africa. It is a very pervasive issue, and it's often referred to as a pandemic for women due to the high rates of femicide and domestic violence. And this is because of the legacy that was left by apartheid and the structural inequality that affects marginalized women of color who are more vulnerable to abuse, and because of the deeply rooted patriarchy that perpetuates and holds dominant toxic gender roles that allow women to be subjugated to this violence. And then weak law enforcement and judicial systems, as well as a lack of support for survivors, is also why it is so prevalent in South Africa. And then here is some statistics that really stood out to me. They're very similar to the ones that Elise shared. So a woman is killed every 3 hours in South Africa, which is 5 times higher than the global average around the world. And then 50% of these assaults were committed by someone who was close to them as of 2019. And then going into who Uyeye is. So who is she? Obviously, Elise shared earlier, but she was a 19-year-old film and media student studying at UCT. She traveled from East London, where she grew up, and she left her family to move here so she could learn about film and media. And she was described as intelligent. She was described as ambitious, and she was described as kind. And she had a promising future ahead of her, which was tragically taken. And then in the middle is just a picture of her. And then tragedy struck on the 24th of August of 2019 when Uyeye went to pick up a parcel from a local Claremont post office, where she was brutally murdered by Luyanda Botha. And then I'm just gonna skip the video for now because I think, okay. And then, so the facts of the case. So Uyeye's tragic murder exposed the widespread issue of gender-based violence in South Africa, and ignited protests nationally, online, and demands for government accountability and systematic reform. So going in just to more facts about the case. So the perpetrator was a civil service officer. These people should be going through background checks. Like Elise mentioned, he was a convicted felon. He was behind bars for 8 years for robberies, and he also had assault charges against him, which were dropped for some reason. But I remember that I watched this video about her family speaking out, and they were so upset that, like, how could someone who had been a convicted criminal become a civil service person? Like, how can someone who was convicted end up working at a post office? And then the response. So this case obviously spurred and ignited widespread protest and demanding the end to the culture of femicide that is occurring in South Africa. And like Elise mentioned, President Cecil Ramaphosa acknowledged that South Africa is facing a crisis regarding gender-based violence. And then the legal action that took place from the case, he confessed and was convicted of her murder, rape, and assault, and was charged with 3 life sentences. And he was also charged with 5 extra years for the injustice for trying to cover it up. But for some reason, he gets 25 years. In the video I watched, he gets 25 years up for parole, which I think is crazy. Like, something that really sparked from this case was bringing back the death penalty. Thank you. All right, and then so here's a timeline of the government action that resulted from the case. So in the 24th of August was when Uyeye was murdered, and then September 2019 was when the I Am Next movement started gaining traction. And this is also when, because of the protests and all the traction and all the momentum it had gained, there was an interim steering committee that began to draft a gender-based violence and femicide national strategic framework. And then by March, and then because not many things were being heard, people started holding them accountable. So then they did eventually release the beginning of a national strategic framework that because of the criticism. And then by February of 2021, because nothing was really happening from the government, like they said they would release this framework, but I think like a proposal was released, but like not much traction was being gained. There was an increase in private sector-led gender-based violence and femicide response funds that were launched. All right, and then so the overview of the hashtag I Am Next movement. So it emerged as a powerful online feminist campaign that was prominent in South Africa, that especially for women, to demand urgent action against gender-based violence. And social media played a really big role. The online mobilization and the collective solidarity and the effective use of the hashtag activism. Like even if you go on Twitter or Instagram, YouTube, I was searching like hashtag am I next to like find a lot of the information that I was looking for. And social media is just such a powerful tool in terms of collectiveness and mobilization. Like it's not just local to Cape Town. People all across South Africa were able to communicate their feelings, like share what they felt, share their experience, which just further helped the momentum of the movement. And then the social change that this movement really ignited conversation, a call for action, because women were scared, like, am I going to be next? Will my friend be next? Will my loved ones be next? Will like an important member of my community be next? Like it's literally hashtag am I next? And that just shows like how crazy and how scary it is for the reality of being a woman in South Africa, and especially for marginalized groups, especially for people of color. Like it's even worse, like their vulnerability is even higher. And then so the social impact and like the public reaction and protests. So in response to Uwewe's murder and during the trial, people marched and were like outside the South African parliament demanding that the government declare gender-based violence a national crisis and called for policy reform. So like while his trial was being taken place, people like literally were protesting in front of parliament being like, we need change, like enough is enough. Like all these cases like have to show for something. And then social media platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook were used to share messages of anger, grief, and solidarity as well. And the social media campaigns generated global attention, with the hashtag trending and gaining international media coverage to help amplify the message beyond South Africa. And then this quote stood out to me, and it was like, this morning I joined thousands of women and men outside Parliament to protest against untenable levels of gender-based violence in this country. One of the speakers concluded her speech by saying, so many women are here asking the question, hashtag am I next again? And then this is just a photo of the protest, just to show like how impactful these were. And then this online feminist solidarity highlighted the systematic nature of violence against women in South Africa, moving beyond individual cases to expose the widespread culture of gender inequality and the failure of the government to address gender-based violence effectively. All right, and then these are some activists within the movement. So Amira Conrad, she's a theater maker and an outspoken gender-based violence activist. Her work focuses on decolonizing theater, but she has also spoken out about hashtag am I next, saying things such as, we don't know if we're going to be next. The next headline, women in South Africa are unsure of their safety, they're afraid, they don't want to be afraid, and they shouldn't be afraid, and if they're not a victim or a survivor themselves, it's one of their friends. And then another activist that really stood out to me was Koleka Putuma. She's a South African poet who has won many awards for her work. And a quote that is really big that stood out to me was, "I don't want to die with my hands up and my legs open." And this quote is really powerful and really prominent in the gender-based violent activism community, and it just really stood out to me. And she is also a poet, and she's a writer and a strong activist focusing on terms of like womanhood, race, and homophobia. And another one of her poems that are really powerful is a poem called Every 3 Hours, which was published on the Johannesburg Review of Books. And I'm just going to quickly read an excerpt, and it really highlights the reality that South African women face, and it speaks out on the rate on which South African women are murdered. And it goes, "Every 3 hours, one of us does not make it. This country hangs our dignity at half-mast. Waves of our bodies are lessons to be learnt as moments that should teach us something, as modules, tests, experience. My existence is not for your teaching. To dislocate my mother's throat 6 feet under and compensate her grief with scholarships and amended policies that have gathered dust before they have even been drafted." And then that's just a small excerpt. You can find the full poem online. And then, so Uwewe's murder was just a really big turning point. There have been countless cases, some that Elise mentioned, but it just goes to show the insane reality that South African women have to face and live with. And it shouldn't be a reality. Obviously, like the ability to live is a basic human right, and women are tired of feeling scared, of fighting, of having to feel this way. So yeah, thanks. And then these are my